Let's get started. I'm happy to see so many of you back for the second round of this lecture on political economy of the Revolving Door. So as promised yesterday, today we're going to talk about what firms gain from hiring people with a background in politics. And we have an exciting agenda ahead of us. I'm going to introduce the topic from a bit of a wider perspective, and then I'm going to concentrate a bit on evidence from the stock market, then evidence from the lobbying market, and then finally I'm going to talk about, this is an uncreative headline, but I'm going to talk about a bit about some of my own research on how firms might benefit from political connections because they can use them to avoid the enforcement of regulatory rules. Okay, so let's just dive into it. The main focus of today is going to be this side of the demand side on the labor market for former public officials. Now, what we focused on yesterday was mainly the incentives that are presented for legislators before they walk through the revolving door. So we discussed how the lucrative jobs that await them on the other side of the revolving door might incentivize them and incentivize them differentially to leave office. And we spoke a bit about how this incentivizes a certain type of behavior. Today we're going to talk about the selective benefits that firms can gain by hiring former legislators in particular. And as it turns out, this is interesting and important from a theoretical perspective as well, because if firms gain political influence, that is, if they manage to use the revolving door to influence the content of legislation, the content of regulatory rules, that turns out to be a good that is public to more than the firm itself. Therefore, if the firm wants to incentivize some kind of behavior among legislators before they leave office, they need to overcome a collective action problem. They overcome this collective action problem by gaining a financial benefit from hiring the legislator in itself. Now let's talk a bit about what it is that they gain. And that's, so basically, having a background in politics is an asset. It's a compound of assets, actually. When you hire a former legislator, a former bureaucrat, or a former staffer, he or she brings with her both her expertise, some information about what's going on, but also the social connections that she has through her working life. The question is whether firms can benefit financially from these connections. I'm pretty convinced that on average it seems like they can. I'll show you a lot of evidence that points in this direction. One of the more interesting questions that I think the literature still doesn't have a very convincing answer of is why firms gain from hiring revolvers. As we'll see, there's only very little evidence on the mechanisms, and I'll talk a bit about potential mechanisms later on. Let's start today with an anecdote like yesterday. Let's talk about the appointment of Timothy Geithner as the Secretary of the Treasury. So Geithner was a career public servant. He wasn't like, so very often when academic studies look at these hiring events and see how political connections shape the fortunes of firms, they look at people who worked in the private sector and then transitioned into government, or worked in government and transitioned into the private sector. Geithner is a bit different because he didn't work in the private sector. He was a public servant, but he did have political connections to important firms. Importantly, he, as a public servant, he had a lot of meetings with large banks during the financial crisis, the early years of the financial crisis. And he also served on a variety of boards with investment bankers. Now, this affords him connections to important companies. And the question that we want to answer now is whether and how the market reacted to news of his appointment as Treasury Secretary. And Darren Acemoglu and some of his co-authors have looked into this. So let's start by looking at that. This is admittedly not the prettiest or easiestly readable graph in the history of research, but let's give it a go. What we see here on the vertical axis is basically time, and what was on the horizontal axis, sorry. And what we see on the vertical axis is the abnormal returns on the stock market that firms that have some connection to Geithner experienced before and after the news of this appointment. This red line in the middle is when news broke, and as we see, the abnormal returns that these companies were facing shoots up very markedly. That is, they saw stock market returns that were almost 5% higher than the market. It drops down very fast afterwards, which turns out to be a trend in this, a general pattern in this kind of event study. So this seems to indicate that the market, at least, expected that that the appointment of Geithner would benefit the firms that he had connections to. This turns out to, remember I said he had connections through both meetings and through board service. It turns out to hold the same pattern no matter which kind of connection Acemoglu and his friends look at. So like yesterday when we looked at the case of Evan Bay, this is an anecdote. So we want to know whether this is a general trend. So does the stock market generally react positively to news of political connections? And it turns out that yes it does. So Go et al. In 2015 looked at the narrow election of people who who graduated from the same university class as CEOs to governorships in the U.S. And they find that when a person who's connected to a CEO through studying at the same university is narrowly elected, the firm that the CEO owns operates, sees large returns. We're talking 2 or 3% of normal returns. So Goldman, Aiton Goldman, and some of his co-authors, they published a series of papers on connections and stock market reactions, and they found that looking at directors who used to serve in Congress, when their former party loses an election, the stock market reacts to that as well, which seems to indicate that their connections will be less valuable. The market also reacts when a director of a company is appointed to the bureaucracy. So firms gain more upon that kind of news. And finally, more specifically about the revolving door, when legislators leave office to become to serve on boards of directors, the market reacts positively as well. This seems to be a pretty general trend across a number of studies. It is widely replicated. There are exceptions, of course. So these are average effects. That is, the market doesn't necessarily react positively every time news breaks of a political connection. An important exception is a study that Ray Fisman and some other people published in 2012, where they look at the connections of Vice President Cheney, and they find that contrary to popular belief, the firms connected to Cheney did not experience positive gains based on those connections. which is interesting. Also, as I indicated earlier, these are short-term effects. They tend to hold for a very brief amount of time, maybe 10 days or so. Okay, so what should we take away from this evidence? So, first of all, I think it's pretty safe to say that firms value political connections because they are valuable. That seems a bit circular, but we could plausibly have observed a situation where the market did not react to news of political connections. But it does. So it seems that that firms do gain, at least on the stock market, upon gaining a political connection. This is obviously, I think, informative about the American political economy. So it tells us that investors, they use political connections as a heuristic to decide which companies to invest in. That is very likely to be a economically inefficient way to distribute resources. It's not necessarily so, but I think it probably is. And it could connect, and it could indicate a deeper kind of problem in the American political economy, that markets value political connections as highly as they do. The problem is that we don't know why investors value political connections. So what we've seen until now, the evidence that I've laid out for you guys, is that they value it. We don't know what it is about a political connection that investors react to. And that is basically why we can't, based on the stock market evidence, move beyond the second point here, that it has to be important, right? We don't really know why, though. So basically, from the existing evidence, it's difficult to tease out mechanisms. So I think I will move on to a market where we can tease out some other mechanisms. Yeah, go on. Wait, I think we should wait until the mic gets there. Okay.
Is there a difference between the stock market changes for companies that are in more regulated industries versus less regulated industries?
Yes, that tends to be a finding in most of the papers that present results on that tends to find that the returns are driven by firms in regulated industries. I think that there probably is a file draw problem in this literature. I think that because there's a lot of differences between studies in whether they report that kind of analysis or not. So I don't think we don't have enough evidence yet to know whether it's broadly the case that the result holds. But I think it probably holds many places, and it's an important finding, right? Because it shows us that what investors react to is partly based on the political environment. Yeah.
Yeah, somewhat related question about why these fluctuations are so short term. It seems indicative of maybe just an irrationality in the market because these aren't sustained gains in the stock market. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I agree. I think you're right about that. I think that's a problem that's difficult to address within this framework, basically, because effects might go away for a variety of reasons. Other stuff might happen as well. But I think you're right. I've had those thoughts myself. And that's why I think that to really get around the question of political connections, we need evidence that's not based on the stock market. But I think that's a very good point. Are there any more questions before we move on? Oh, yeah.
Hi, is there any evidence showing a change in the actual company fundamentals of any sort whatsoever? And someone who has connections to the bank comes in, getting change in the cash flow over time?
So I'll speak a bit, I'll present some evidence on that later. There is some, and it's mixed. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the evidence that we have from the market for lobbying services. So this market works in the way that you have a number of contract lobbying firms out there, and firms hire these contract lobbying firms, or these hired guns, as you sometimes call them, to basically affect policy outcomes or gain some other kind of political asset. That makes this a pretty good lab in which to test whether you see whether political factors can drive these market interests. So, importantly, lobby clients might prefer revolvers over lobbyists that do not have a background in politics. And if they do, this would be an important piece of the puzzle of why firms value political connections. I want to zoom in on a study that I think is extremely well done, and I think you'll see why in a second. So this is a study that Blaine, Egerod, and some co-authors published at the AER in 2012. And they leveraged the fact that legislative staffers often leave before the member of Congress, leave public service before the member of Congress that they work for. When they do, and when their former employer, the former legislator that they work for, remains in office, they bring an important connection with them into their work as a lobbyist. However, when the senator or the congressman leaves office, they lose this connection. So one important feature of this design, because what happens here is that Blaine Egerod can then trace the revenue that's generated by the individual lobbyist before and after the connection leaves office. Importantly, no expertise effect will remain. So normally, when we talk about the value of the lobbyist, we have to distinguish between whether they have connections or whether they have expertise. And these two kinds of assets will typically be correlated. So people who have many connections will probably have a lot of expertise as well. But because their expertise remains constant around the time that the legislator leaves office, we don't have this problem, and we can isolate the effect of connections on the revenue that the lobbyists earn for their companies. And this is what happens. So on the horizontal axis, we have the time until the legislator leaves office, the Senate in this case, I think it is. And on the vertical axis, we have the revenue generated by the connected lobbyists. And as we can see, in the time leading up until the hiring, the revenue they generate remains relatively stable. There's some fluctuation. And then when the senator leaves office, the revenue they generate shoots down. And it shoots down by a lot. So this indicates very strongly that lobby clients, they strongly prefer to work with lobbyists and to hire contract lobbyists that have political connections to senators. When those lobbyists lose this connection, they become less valuable on the lobbying market. Now, because the lobbying market is different from the stock market, because the lobbying market essentially deals with attempts at political influence, this is an important piece of information that adds significantly to the knowledge that we just saw on the stock market. And it doesn't quite address your point from before, because this might still be irrational, right? The lobby clients could think that connections, could think wrongly that connections make whatever goal they want to achieve more achievable, but it might not actually be so in reality. We can't see from this kind of evidence. This research has been extended quite a bit in recent years, because it made a big splash when it was published back in 2012, and rightly so, I think. So one way it has been extended is by Josh McCrane, who's a graduate student at Emory, who makes the point that when a senator leaves office, most of his staff is going to leave with him as well. So what happens in this situation is a compound treatment, basically. So what you see is the combined effect of a connection to a senator and of the staff that works for the senator. So what Josh does is that he tries to filter out these two effects. And what we see in this graph is on the dotted line, we have the revenue generating effect of a connection to a senator as the number of connections increase. And the solid line represents connections to staffers that work in Congress. And strikingly, what this figure shows is that connections to more senators doesn't really do anything. It suggests that connections to staffers who work for those senators is what's doing the heavy lifting in this situation. And that's interesting, because legislative staffers and members of Congress, they have remarkably different resources. They control remarkably different assets. So typically what we think is that a senator has to be a generalist, for instance, more generalist than staffers who work for him. But they also don't necessarily have that many connections to other people who work in Congress. In any case, it's pretty striking that senators who are generally thought of as the most powerful legislators in the world, connections to them doesn't really seem to generate a lot of revenue on the lobbying market, whereas connections to staffers who many until very recently didn't really treat in their analyses, that connections to them, they matter a lot. Okay. So I'm going to talk a bit about some evidence that I've produced with Josh McCrane, who did this. So what we do here is we go about the investigation in a different way. We look at lobbyists that become bureaucrats. So the idea is that when a lobbyist leaves her firm to enter the bureaucracy, the lobbying firm gains a connection. And very much like the Blaine Vidal piece, if the lobbying firm sees increased revenue after their former lobbyist transitions into government, this has to be driven by connections, can't be driven by some kind of expertise. The specific setting we look at here is the appointment of the election of President Trump, which, because it was to the lobbying market, there's a lot of anecdotes out there that seems to confirm that the lobbying market did not expect the election of President Trump. It presents a pretty good case for a quasi-experiment. So what we do here is we look at three groups of lobbying firms. all the way low down, we look at the firms who never have a lobbyist appointed to the bureaucracy. In the top, we look at firms who gain a connection, but do so 1/4 later than the firms who gain it in the beginning. So these firms down here gain a connection right when Trump is appointed, right when Trump takes office in January 2017, and the people up here, they don't get the connection, they don't get the lobbyist appointed until 1/4 later. So what happens is, if we track the trends of these firms, they evolve in relative parallel up until the time of the appointment. And when the lobbyist is appointed into the bureaucracy, the revenue that the quarterly revenue that these lobbying firms down here make, it shoots up, and it shoots up by approximately 20%. If anything, the lobbying firms who have their lobbyists hired into the bureaucracy later, the negative trend that they were already on just keeps on going. So I think this is a valuable evidence for a few reasons. So, as I remarked upon yesterday, bureaucrats former bureaucrats make up a very, very large percentage of the population of registered lobbyists. And not a lot of work has been done on whether connections to the bureaucracy matters. So, together with all of this evidence, it helps us build an idea. It helps us make the idea that political connections matter broadly very plausible. It might be that connections to legislators is driven by staff connections and not the legislators themselves, but connections to Congress matters. Connections to the bureaucracy seems to matter as well. And finally, the revolvers, they know it. So this is a working paper, which is written up by Maria Silva. And what she shows is interesting because it builds on the Blaine-Vidal design. Basically, what we look at here is, instead of looking at the revenue that a lobbyist generates, we look at the probability that the lobbyist will return to her former job in public service. So what happens is basically that what we have on the horizontal axis is the number of connections that a current revolver former staffer loses at any given point in time. And here we have on the vertical axis, we have the predicted probability of her returning into public service. And what we see is that as the revolver loses more connections, the probability that she will return to public service increases by, these are models based on all lobbyists, all registered lobbyists. So the predicted probabilities, they seem small, but in actuality, they're pretty big. This shows that this is not just some weird fluke of the market. It shows that the actors on the market, even the revolvers, they know what's going on, and they know it very well. When they lose a connection, they know that they will become less valuable for lobby clients, and that makes them return to public service to renew their connections. So what can we learn from this? I think it does add some additional meat to the stock market analysis that I showed in the beginning. It shows that connections on their own connections divorced from expertise matters when lobby clients make decisions about which contract lobbying firms they want to hire. There is some evidence out there. There's not been done a lot of work on it, but Bertrand from Booth has done some work that shows that expertise matters as well, which I think is an important nuance to this, to the evidence that I just showed. There is some evidence as well, I mentioned this yesterday, that this is partly because both expertise and connections buys access. This is from work that I did in an EU setting, where I show with some of my co-authors that when a company hires a former EU official, the probability that they will gain meetings with high-level EU officials increase. I think that is likely to, it would be likely to replicate in the US setting if data on meetings with officials actually existed, but it doesn't, unfortunately. The question is, and much like the evidence on the lobbying market, on the stock market, is that we don't really know what clients use or think that they can use connections for. What this what this evidence from the market for lobbying services indicates is that lobby clients who seek to gain some kind of political influence, they value political connections. We don't know why they value them, we just know that they value them. So a different way to phrase this question is to ask, what role politically connected individuals play in a company? I want to show you some of my own stuff on that in a bit. But first, I want to discuss some theories that are out there about what role revolvers play in firms. So these theories, they all depart from the notion that both access and expertise of political expertise of a revolver or of a lobbyist more broadly will aid lobbying clients. So one theory that I think is appealing, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises, is a theory that I remarked upon a bit yesterday, that Tim LaPura and Trey Thomas have written up in their book from 2017. So in their theory, lobbyists, their role isn't to help clients gain political influence. They act more as political insurance. So what they do is they help their clients prepare for what they call legislative drive-bys. Basically, legislation can wipe out any market with the stroke of a pen. And a lot of, especially small and medium-sized firms out there, they stand no chance in influencing this legislation. So what they can do instead is that they can use this prior information in the hope to navigate and mitigate and avoid the costs that legislative drive-bys might impose on them. I've spoken to some revolvers, and it seems that many view their role as fitting this description pretty well. I think, though, that the description is probably most fitting for, well, small and medium-sized firms, because they don't have the resources to influence policy that much. A different theory, which hasn't been applied to the revolving door as far as I know, is related to this, but is a bit different. So revolvers might, because of their expertise and their connections, be able to extract information about what's coming. Now, if you are a big enough player, if you have enough resources, then you might be able to act on this information and your knowledge about legislation, future legislation or future regulation, in a way that's beneficial to you. So David Feiner, who's in the audience today, has done some very interesting work on meetings between bankers and the New York Fed, and shows that meetings tend to increase when important decisions in the Fed are forthcoming. I think that this pattern probably holds for revolvers as well, and not just bankers, and more broadly probably for legislation and broadly for regulation. But it remains to be seen. Finally, revolvers might be able to extract resources. I think this is probably the idea that most people has, and Eaton Goldman and his co-authors has presented some evidence that revolvers are able to extract government procurement contracts for the firms they work in. The evidence on this is still relatively sparse, and I think future work should probably look a bit more into it. So before we move on to discuss revolvers and the role they play in regulatory enforcement, do you guys have any questions or comments? Yeah.
On the chart you showed where you had the revenue of the lobbying firms, and then there was a time series of when the lobbyist was hired. Yeah, that one. So they're treated later. I think you said that the very top line is where the lobbyist was hired later.
Yes.
Than the middle line, which is the dark line.
Yes.
So why does the timing of when the lobbyist was hired impact the revenues? Once they're hired, wouldn't the revenues go up regardless of the timing of when they're hired in the administration?
Yes. So what this shows is it's centered around the time when this group of firms hires a lobbyist. So this group of firms don't have a lobbyist hired into the bureaucracy in this timeline. So what we compare here is revenue that's generated in the first quarter of 2017. And what we see here is that when this group of firms gains a connection, but this group of firm doesn't, there is a divergence in the revenue that they make. If we had extended the time series to one quarter later, when this group of firms also get a connection, we would see a similar spike in their revenue. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Great. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so all of these theories are about policy decisions. They're about legislative decisions mainly, and they're about access to people who work with legislation and expertise on legislation. But all of these legislative decisions, they have to be implemented by bureaucrats. And if political connections can influence the decisions of bureaucrats, firms might be able to avoid enforcement of costly regulation. And this is potentially extremely valuable. Sorry. So specifically, whereas I touched upon this a bit earlier, if you are lucky enough to shape the content of a rule, or shape the content of legislation, that's likely to be a public good, and it's likely to benefit all firms that are in your industry. However, if you don't care about shaping the content of legislation, but care about avoiding its enforcement, then you gain a fully private good that basically only benefits you as a firm. So I've done some work that I presented earlier this year at Booth on how the revolving door shapes the tax payment that firms pay. So what I've done in this paper is that I've tracked the tax rates over time that firms that hire former legislators pay. And this graph shows some of the main results. So, the setup of this graph, I think, by now. On the horizontal axis, we have the time remaining until a legislator is hired, and on the vertical axis, we have the tax rates that they pay the year after the legislator is hired. So what we see is that tax rates remain relatively stable in time, and when the legislator is hired here, tax rate shoots down, and they shoot down by a lot. So average tax rates in this group of firms, they decrease, and they decrease very, very much. They can save a lot of money in taxes from this. So we can separate out the effects of individual traits of the legislators that they hire. Specifically, this graph shows a bunch of traits. So in the first panel up here, we contrast the tax saving, when you hire a member of Congress who used to serve on a committee that has oversight of the IRS. That's those guys here, with members of Congress who has not served on committees with oversight of the IRS. And what we see, first of all, is that the decrease in tax rates are driven by people who served on oversight, who had oversight with the IRS. Second, we use some of the data that I presented for you yesterday. This is a measure of how well connected a legislator was in Congress based on how many people that he or she gained, had co-sponsor legislation that she proposed. And what we see is that as her connectedness increases, the drop in tax rates, the tax saving increases. And down here we can look at both characteristics simultaneously. So if you did not serve on an oversight committee, there is no additional payoff to being highly connected. But if you did, the additional payoff to being highly connected is very much larger. So this tells us two things. It tells us that something in the committee service seems to make it easier for firms to avoid paying a lot of taxes. A lot of stuff goes on in committees, so these guys might be exceptionally knowledgeable about the tax code. That's one thing. They might also, the IRS knows them, they know they're highly connected. This could plausibly make the IRS stay awake, give them an easier time to lower their taxes. This all hinges on the assumption that the IRS actually changes its enforcement behavior. The problem with investigating whether that's the case, though, is that there is no publicly available firm-level data that is published by the IRS. So to get around that problem, I had to hand code the 10K reports that these firms file to look at whether or not the IRS initiates an audit of a company in any given year. Especially since 2006, firms generally report the initiation of an audit because it's potentially extremely costly, so they have to. It's a treasure trove. 10Ks are not leveraged all that much in studies of political connections, but they're a treasure trove, and they really should be. So what we find here is that when a firm hires a revolver, a former legislator, the probability that they are audited by the IRS drops. And there is no change prior to the hiring. So these effects are not driven by pre-treatment trends, and they're robust to a bunch of different specifications. I don't show all of them here. But this seems to confirm the notion that the tax saving effects here are driven by differential enforcement by the IRS, and that the firms anticipate this and act more aggressively when they report their taxes. Why this happens is more difficult to say, right? So as I said before, legislators, especially the people who served on the Finance and Ways and Means Committee, have just an immense amount of knowledge about enforcement of tax, of the tax code, but also just of the content of the tax code. They might be able to leverage this to help the firm that comes to employ them. A different caveat that I want to note here is that what we contrast here is a situation where the firm has a revolver hired to before they have a revolver hired. A different but equally important contrast that we would like to make in the ideal world would be whether you can observe the same effect of hiring an extremely talented CFO or something like that, right? Or just a very, very good group of tax lawyers. We don't know because, well, it's not the counterfactual that we raise here. But what this shows at least is that legislators has some set of skills, especially legislators who have worked with tax throughout their career. They have some set of skills that can help a company that hires them save on the tax bill. Now, I phrase this as a question of enforcement. So if the revolving door should benefit firms broadly because they can avoid enforcement, we should see we should see that the firm's financial performance should react as well to the hiring of a former legislator. That's not generally the case. So in the panel A, the left panel, we look at how pre-tax income reacts to the hiring of a revolver. And what we find is generally small reactions that are statistically insignificant. We can also look at the pre-tax operating profit margin, and there as well, the changes are very, very small. You can't really see it because I've scaled the y-axis to be narrow, but there's no reaction here either. If we had looked at various measures of after-tax operating performances, we would see a reaction because that takes into account the tax saving that they gain as well. So I think that the important takeaway from this is that this first paper, the one on taxes, shows that there is, at least in some fields, in some regulatory spaces, firms can gain from political connections. What the results from this shows is basically that that is not the case in all regulatory spaces. So connections, they matter to firms. That's basically been the point of today's lecture, right? Investors use connections to make investment decisions. Lobby clients choose which lobbying firms to engage with based on connections. And sometimes firms can use connections to avoid enforcement. I want to put emphasis on the sometimes. We can only answer part of the question, of the why question. A lot of work is being done on that at the moment. This is a field that's developing in very rapid pace, and I hope that we'll see a lot more work on it in the future, and that we'll get smarter on what's actually going on. So to wrap up today's and yesterday's lecture, what we saw yesterday was that the revolving door does shape patterns of selection out of office. Lucrative employment does attract public servants away from public service, and it attracts them differentially. And the differential part is very likely to matter for the representation that citizens receive. What we also saw was that the lucrativeness of private sector employment instills incentives for a certain kind of behavior among legislators. So we saw that legislators, they exert more effort, they vote more moderately, they vote more in favor of bills that will benefit the future employer, and they propose bills that will benefit the future employer. So what we've just seen today is that the revolving door is an asset for firms, and as I've also said, the mechanisms for why are still being uncovered. I personally think that regulatory enforcement is likely to be an important part of the story, and is a very interesting focus area for future studies. That's all I have for today. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
How frequently do we see firms hiring ex-politicians around the same time? So more than one ex-politician going to the same firm? And do you expect the effect of the paying less taxes to be more pronounced when a single firm has more of these connections with more individuals?
So I don't think it happened ever in the data that I've collected. The same firms do hire politicians, like several politicians, but not at the same time. I think based on the evidence I showed you that whether the effect will increase in the number of politicians will depend on the politician's expertise. So probably, the answer will probably be yes if they served on a committee with oversight. But there's probably going to be marginally decreasing returns. But that's all speculation. We have one question. Yeah.
Yeah, can you just talk generally about the business model of lobbying firms and speak to how they go about trying to either generate revenues or cut costs for their clients outside of maybe just the tax burden? And then as a sort of follow-up to that, if there are direct monetary incentives that they face to influence legislation one way or another?
That's a difficult question. So So what you're asking is what services lobbying firms perform for their clients.
Yes.
So I think that, the classical way of looking at that would be that they try to influence legislation. But newer research points to basically the roles that I don't know if this is too far back. So these are likely to be the jobs that lobbyists perform for their clients. So basically, if I were to speculate, they would, for small and medium-sized enterprises, they would help navigate the legislative space when they're on call for when something happens that's potentially costly, so they can help give advice to their client as to how they should react and whether they should be afraid. and when it comes to larger firms, they are probably more likely to work on extracting information or other kinds of resources. Obviously, an important part of being a lobbyist is also getting access, getting meetings with important decision makers. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, the second part of the question was sort of motivated by the thought of, are lobbying firms just hired and then paid regardless of any measurable impact that they have, or are they incentivized in some way to directly put their hand on the scale?
Yeah, so I think that there is a big agency problem on the lobbying market that has almost not been researched. So I think that especially when it comes to small firms, to small lobby clients, they are very unlikely to know what their contract lobbyist is doing and whether it matters. But I mean, when it comes to larger firms who probably already have large groups of in-house lobbyists and lawyers and stuff like that, they are much more likely to be able to, keep a tabs on what's going on.
So earlier you showed some data on some firms benefiting from having their employees hired into specific committees. Do you see any of those firms that do benefit? Do you see any attributes linking those firms together?
So which study are you talking about now?
The data where you showed about the gross margin, some firms having a little bit higher gross margin, but not being statistically significant.
All right.
On the
Yes.
overall level.
So this.
Yeah.
So you're thinking about whether there are heterogeneous effects.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, there's no evidence of heterogeneity. So I've looked at practically every feature of the firm and every feature of the legislator that they hires, and there's not a lot of evidence that specific features are more conducive to extracting gains, which is interesting in itself, I think. Thanks, it was a good question. Yeah.
If I understood you correctly earlier, you said that more regulated firms see higher effects. I was wondering if there's evidence about more heavily subsidized industries like agricultural or like firms that benefit from, say, Exim Bank.
I don't remember having seen any evidence to the fact, but I would speculate that the effects of the regulatory, like having a lot of regulation around you, probably extends to being subsidized. But it's something that definitely should be studied in the future.
Have you looked at all at the interaction between expertise and connections? I mean, it's kind of broken out as sort of separate things, but it seems like expertise would be more or less valuable depending on how many or how few connections a particular lobbyist or lobbying firm has.
Yes, that's a good point. I think no one has looked at it yet, and basically I think it's because we lack good measures of expertise. So connections are easily observable, whereas expertise is super difficult. So the way that it traditionally has been measured is by looking at whether you have focused on one legislative area throughout your career or more. And the more you are focused on, the more generalist and the less expert you are. And I'm not sure that that's a very good measure. So I think that future studies should probably work at, well, it would be extremely important to get a better measure of expertise. And one thing that would be obviously important is to investigate the question that you posed, definitely. Okay, so I think maybe we should stop, or
One last question.
One last question, okay.
Are these phenomena observed only in the federal level, or do you see, do you observe this kind of phenomenon also in the local level, state level?
I don't know of any studies that have looked below the federal level, but it probably should be done because there's a lot more interesting variation there, and I mean, yes, it would be extremely interesting to look at. Okay, thank you very much.